Hello, everyone, and welcome to Columbia University. My name is Alex Halliday. I'm director of the Earth Institute at Columbia. I'm also quite heavily involved in leading the discussions and the development of a climate school, which is the first school at Columbia for 25 years, first new school. And it's very exciting. And we've been particularly interested to build up the topics around climate that we believe are really important for the future of the planet. Some of you may know about what we've been doing, but actually there's going to be much more happening over the next few months. So stay tuned. And in this context, it's particularly exciting because now that we've got a climate school, like any other school, is somewhere where you might expect to hear lectures. And this is our first lecture of the Columbia Climate School. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce you tonight, Mario Herrero, who is from CSIRO in Australia. His research focuses on the issues of the ways in which food security and ecosystems are really important for us going forward. And in particular, he's been looking at the areas of sustainable intensification of agriculture, climate mitigation, adaptation, livestock systems, and healthy and sustainable diets. He's an immensely distinguished individual with over 170 peer-reviewed publications. And of course, he has many other kinds of publications as well, which have been around delivering sort of impact in the world through his areas of expertise. He's a regular contributor to important global initiatives at the heart of the sustainability of global food systems. For example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, etc., and the Lancet Commission on Obesity. So these are, it's great to have him here. He's been working on a variety of issues to do with how one creates healthy diets in different places around the world, and at the same time think about the sustainability of those systems going forward. One of the important ways in which he's been contributing is to build up engagement with some of the major organizations where these fora, the fora for discussion around these particular issues around the world. So he's become a corresponding fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He's an associate fellow of Chatham House. He's also involved with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and he's an honorary professor of agriculture and food innovation at the University of Queensland in Australia. So today he's going to be talking to us about the link between climate change and global food systems, raising the critical question, can we feed the planet and stay within planetary boundaries? We all know that the global food system will need to change profoundly if it is going to provide humanity with healthy food that is grown sustainably. Mario will talk about this and the necessary innovations that that are needed for this. So following his talk, we will have 15 minutes of moderated Q&A. So please enter your questions into the chat box at that time. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mario Herrero as our speaker this evening. Mario.
Hi everyone, it is a real pleasure to be here. I'll share my screen. I've prepared a presentation here that should run for about half an hour, 35 minutes to introduce this topic. Okay, that's great. So yes, so what I would like to talk to you about is what do we need to do to really transform the global food system, and how we need to build an integrative agenda for doing so. It's really at the intersections of disciplines that we will find many of the solutions for dealing with a wicked problem like climate change. It's a very integrated problem as such. And what I would like to do here is to just take you through a series of questions that we will need to solve to ensure that we get to 2050 with a food system that actually really is more resilient to cope with climate change, more equitable, and more sustainable in general. So To start, I would say that now there's absolutely no doubt of the need to increase the sustainability of food systems. I think that we've achieved global convergence, and you can see it in these examples of major publications on the topic. As a good example, the IPCC Climate Change and Land Report was accepted in plenary. It's the first time that all governments accept that food systems actions need to change, and at the same time, the first time that everybody agreed that we also need to deal with issues around excessive consumption. So, I mean, there's a big agenda mounting in all these aspects. What are the key issues? I think that you've probably heard this over and over again, but just a little recap. Malnutrition in all its forms is actually causing tremendous issues around the world, tremendous costs for the global health system. Non-communicable diseases are in the order of $800 billion in terms of costs, which is enormous. Climate change per se contributing between 21 and 37% of anthropogenic emissions, and with very slow rates of change, which is very different to the energy sector in many ways, where you see incredible transformations due to technology and so on. So we'll need to deal with these issues explicitly. On the other hand, we've heard about the planetary boundaries, and here we have the classic Rockström diagram that has shown us that we've exceeded our safe operating spaces for biodiversity loss, for the nitrogen cycling, way too much reactive nitrogen in the system, and we are on the way of trespassing some of these barriers further, notably the climate change one. On top of that, there's a range of enormous social issues and power asymmetries and policy distortions that prevent us to achieve the intended outcomes. And this is something that we'll need to feature prominently in the discussion on how to change the food system in the future. We are in the Anthropocene, where all those lines are really high. The age of human-induced global change, and what you see here is from the typical increases in population, incomes, all the way to McDonald's restaurant, just to show you an example of how diets have changed. Important increases in communications, etc. So, you know, it's really a pressure cooker. That's the way I describe it. And what we need to find is really valves in different parts of the pot to really reduce the pressures that we have. Notably, one of the critical questions for reducing the pressure on all of this is, well, mitigation, adaptation, and the co-benefits of the food systems responses. How fast and how soon? There's no doubt, and this is something that we explored with Cynthia Rosenzweig in the special report on climate change, and then there's no doubt that there's a lot of options. And you can see here on my right the types of options that we're dealing with to adapt and to mitigate greenhouse gases from food systems. But in reality, what are going to be the incentive structures, and how are we going to ensure that adoption rates for all this barrage of technologies, what are the incentives for farmers and for key value chains to adopt? The other key question is, what are we going to do with pandemics? And, you know, pandemics is just one more of the potentially of the extreme events that we have. So we need to really think very carefully how to plan ahead, taking into consideration the unknowns. It is very difficult, but it requires a change of mindset into how we're going to do a sustainable development in the future. So what I would like to do is to take you through a series of questions now that I think are essential, that will put to test these 6 pillars that you see here, which I believe are the key pillars of integrative science in food systems and climate change. One of them relates to healthy diets from sustainable food systems. It's a topic that has been in vogue, well, last decade probably. Climate risk and resilience. We often talk a lot about climate risk and resilience, and we need to integrate it much better with all the other dimensions. Land use and environmental solutions. How do we think of transformational innovation in the food system? What are the options, etc.? How are we going to ensure that we focus on livelihoods and equity? This is really about leaving no one behind, and this actually requires intentional ancillary actions to ensure that that happens. And then the economics and governance. We need to do much better at designing incentives and designing ways of making this happen in a way that is attractive for a range of investors and for key practitioners. So the first one, can we achieve healthy diets from sustainable food systems, leaving no one behind? Where's this stemming from? This stems from the fact that what we eat really impacts the environment and our health. We knew that diets were associated with greenhouse gas emissions and had a very high mitigation potential, and we've known this since the mid 2000s. So 2009, Elke Steffes produced a classic paper, but it was really when the linkages with health occurred that this really became a very persuasive argument for dealing with simultaneously with the climate change problem, because this is the kind of integrated problem that with some good impacts, you then achieve great gains in multiple sectors. And that's very important from a policy perspective. So how does this link occur? Well, it links through the types of diets. Basically, the food that we eat all has different greenhouse gas emissions intensities. They use different amounts of land. So that's why you see that diets of different types, whether it's Mediterranean, pescatarian, vegetarian, will have different emissions footprints because they contain different amounts of different foods. What this translates to is in really reductions, different land footprints, and different land footprints that actually translate into different amount of greenhouse gases. So you can think, well, yeah, if I reduce my consumption of, I don't know, of meats, then the greenhouse gas profile of my diet will decrease and so on. But it was after this was done, then the linkages also between the quantities of what we consumed, of the different products that we consumed, when this was related to the risks of non-communicable diseases, it's when this became attractive. Look, for example, at the reduction in the relative risk of Mediterranean, pescatarian, or vegetarian diets relative to what we consume now on diabetes, on cancer, on mortality, etc. So it's quite important. So knowing this, then the Lancet organized a commission to really assess this across a broad environmental space, focused from the EAT-Lancet, from the rostrum planetary boundaries. So what does the EAT-Lancet tell us? Okay, basically the story is very simple. In the past, we used to have a big piece of meat as the star of the dish. Well, let's not make that big piece of meat the star of the dish. Let's make the veggies the start of the dish. That's the simplest interpretation of the EAT-Lancet diet. Let's make sure that our plate has a lot of colors, has mostly vegetables, has whole grains, has plant source proteins with small amounts of animal source foods and so on. Very, very low in discretionary foods as well, with added sugars and unsaturated fats. That's the simplest way. When you look at what's happening in the world relative to that diet, what you see is that almost everywhere in the world, we have been consuming an excess of red meat, with notable exceptions like in South Asia, like in Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. Starchy vegetables, we also probably underconsume, and so on. But the key here is that what we are lacking is vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, and nuts. These are the nutrient-rich parts of the diet which we need to increase. These are the ones that we need to probably balance a little bit better. So, you know, there's how do we optimize the system so that we can actually all converge roughly into these kinds of diets. Now, there's some very interesting things occurring here. First of all, not enough fruits and vegetables are produced nor consumed. You know, if you exclude food waste, we are dealing here with only in the worst of the cases, look, 40% of availability of fruits and vegetables. That there needs to be an increased supply response here to be able to deal with the recommendations of the EAT-Lancet diet. It's essential that we focus on that. Then on the other hand, the EAT-Lancet diet is also too expensive for many people. So we really need to focus on how are we going to improve the economics of this diet. Of course, it's an issue of supply. If there's not enough fruits and vegetables, well, they're going to be expensive all around the world. And this brings us to then thinking, well, how can we use then all this nutrition agenda to really as a way of creating development in rural areas by increasing incomes from very nutritious from the sales of very nutritious food and so on, but taking into account the essential planetary boundaries that we're dealing with. Then, you know, quite central to all of this agenda is what is a safe and sustainable operating space for livestock. I think that the consumption of red meat has always been well, it's probably the single biggest component of trying to achieve that healthy and sustainable diet. So this really merits a lot of research. Here you see the demand for livestock products from 1990 to 2015. So the oranges are the orange color are decreases in relative consumption, and the blues are increases. So one critical thing is that the key things that are increasing are, in general terms, of course, there's places where they are decreasing, are milk and also poultry meat on a per capita basis. And the ones that have been stagnating or even negative, contrary to popular belief, bovine meat, for example, bovine meat per capita has stagnated in the last 20 years. So what we see here is the effect of population growth in all the projections leading to the increases in bovine meat consumption. It's not that we're eating more. And even if you take the recent years, we see even the sustainability agenda, especially in OECD countries, even creating bigger decreases in bovine meat. And pig meat is a mixed story where you have enormous increases in you know, basically in East Asia, China, and the rest of the region, which drive the enormous increases in consumption, plus a few other countries, but not so much in Africa and Europe. So there's really, in reality, there's three trajectories. You have pork and poultry growing at an accelerated growth, dairy growing in low and middle income countries, stagnating in the OECD, and red meat stagnating everywhere. But this is really important as part of how we consider the use of land by these different species and so on. Global cropland area has increased by 3% since 1990, and pasture area by about 1% over the same period. And this is important because the boundary condition for the EAT-Lancet study was that we wouldn't allow for additional land use change. So this puts us there roughly in the ballpark. But you know, the key thing is the where and the how, and how are we going to actually create changes in land use that actually move us from kilocalories to producing highly nutritious food. This is actually essential. Continuing with the livestock, well, you know, it's not that livestock has been evil all the time. There have been enormous gains in terms of efficiencies. We are actually producing now 45% less greenhouse gases, 62% less land to produce 1 kilocalorie of livestock than in the 60s. That's enormous. But of course, what's happened that we're using about 200% more nitrogen in the quest to produce more feed in less land. So that's intensification. I wouldn't call it sustainable, but intensification 101. We see production growth in ruminant meat and milk, worryingly still driven largely by the growth in animal numbers. And you know, this is what creates the pressure. The pressure is created by adding one additional head of cattle rather than producing more from the same amount of cattle. This is an example of what's been happening in different parts or in different systems. And what you see here in terms of the dark bar is how bovine numbers have increased relative to the productivity increases in gray. And in the majority of the cases, you see everything still driven by increases in these animal numbers. That is a crucial thing. And the premise for sustainable intensification will be to do what the US did in the 40s. The US went from the US has reduced the livestock herd by what is it, by 80% since the 20s, since the 40s, and they're producing 5 times more animal products in that same period. So you know, there's issues when you do these changes. There's issues around animal welfare that you need to take into account, and so on. But in reality, these kinds of shifts will be important in the future. As I said, well, look, this is typical of low-income countries, and how do we move these flat lines is really the next big question. This of sustainable intensification has not materialized in many of these countries, despite enormous investments by all sorts of donors. So we need to reevaluate the problem efficiently. Then the other big question from a livestock perspective is what role for grasslands? You know, a lot of the integrated assessment community has focused on the future of food, looking at the crops and looking at the relatively more intensive systems. But all of a sudden you have here the biggest land use system on earth, poorly represented or not represented at all in many of these assessments. And it could give us a lot of the answers for how we manage the system effectively. So here, this is work that we did with the Orchidea team, where you see, for example, we showed that the greenhouse gas balances of livestock systems are basically you could say that all in all they're neutral, but they're spatially different. You have a lot of very good carbon sinks in the higher latitudes in very sparse rangelands, while in the more intensive areas you see net increases in greenhouse gases. So when you take into account the whole of the grassland area of the world, it turns out that it's roughly neutral. The sinks from carbon sequestration really cancel the increases in greenhouse gases from the intensive areas. But you know, when I hear sometimes from many people in development saying, well, we have areas of crop, we have a land reserve for croplands that are the grasslands. We could actually start converting the grasslands for croplands. Well, that won't work if we really want to maintain this essential ecosystem service from grassland areas. You know, the whole idea of then making use of the increases in temperature from say in Russia to plant more crops, then will actually need to be very, very carefully examined if we really want to maintain these essential carbon sinks. So these are the kinds of issues that we need to really deal with when looking at the land use patterns. Then a huge question: will a low carbon economy materialize? I have no doubt. I have absolutely no doubt that from an energy perspective, yes. I think that the gains have been enormous in the past in the past decades, but from the agricultural, from the food sector, there are still many things to consider. This is work that we did as part of I believe that this might be from one of the ACME papers with Stefan Frank. And, you know, these are economic mitigation potentials of the agricultural sector. And let's focus on this graph. Well, what are the things that will actually lead to the highest and most attractive mitigation options? Obviously, there are aspects related to consumption of livestock and a little bit crops. Something related to international trade, but the structural what we call relocation of production of livestock plays an enormous part in this mitigation potential. So, you know, in all IPCC work, the notion of using the best areas to produce food and then save or spare land in other regions that might have a carbon sink or a biodiversity areas of high biodiversity interest features prominently. But in reality, how do we achieve this? If we take into account what just happened in the last 4 or 5 years with the, you know, with the trade wars and everything, this actually preempts completely all this relocation of production as a key mitigation practice. So in reality, we need to think of what would be the mechanisms to enable this in a way that we actually satisfy existing trade agreements, or we build new ones to really ensure that this enormous opportunity occurs. There's more than 1 gigaton. Look, this is really more than 1 gigaton of that response potentially occurring. So these are the kinds of things that we need to think about. And this actually materializes mostly in low and middle income countries, where you see, for example, apart from Oceania, Southeast Asia, South Asia feature prominently in this discussion. Then the circular economy. The circular economy is essential and will be essential as a way of dealing with reductions in waste in the future, because this allows us to decouple a lot of the production from the land. So you end up having the products, but not having the associated footprints of water, land use, etc. These have already been accounted for in the production processes. So what we see here, is if we could decouple livestock from land, we could actually produce a lot of livestock. If you take this inner circle, this is a boundary that we created, looking at what are the low opportunity cost lands, grasslands. These grasslands could produce about 7 grams of protein per capita. If you consider that a human needs about 50 grams, you're talking about 18%. That brings us relatively closely to what the EAT-Lancet diet says, just from low opportunity cost lands, lands where you cannot actually, we know you cannot grow crops because you don't have the length of growing period and so on. So that's quite interesting. Now, if we include food waste and start doing safe swill and start feeding especially pigs with this kind of material, say restaurant waste and things like that, then this can actually increase to about 23 grams. That's almost 50% of the protein from livestock, 50% of the human requirements for protein coming from a totally decoupled source. And if you look at what the current consumption of the different regions is, well, at least you have theoretically that Africa and Asia could actually have all their livestock consumption met by circular sources of That's enormous. That's something that deserves a lot more attention. Of course, when the full bioeconomy really gets into place, we're going to end up with a lot of trade-offs. Do we use the material for energy? Do we use the material as a soil amendment? Or do we actually feed it to livestock or to insects, then to feed livestock or to process other things? So the kinds of things that engineering solutions will be extremely important for achieving this, because one of the key things will be to, co-location of plants becomes really important, optimizing the flow of resources in these plants and so on. So there's a big integrative part of a really transdisciplinary part in achieving this circular economy for dealing with the climate mitigation. Then moving on, the structure of farming. This is not a small topic, and especially when you start thinking about what would be the role for smallholders. So I want you to think about these different landscapes. Let me see. Yes, so we know that the target is it's constantly moving. Many of you have seen changes in the last 30, 40 years in the regions where you come from. And this continues to happen. This is an example in West Africa. And this example is noticeable because, this is a low population density area. Now imagine what happens in the high population density areas. How can we actually ensure that the next transition of this system is sustainable and really tries to meet the kinds of goals that we need? A lot of the issues around climate adaptation and mitigation deal with how we're going to use the land and the kinds of systems and the options that we have. So this then becomes essential. And think about the benefits of landscapes. Here we have West Iowa in the US, somewhere in France, northern India, as examples, totally different constructions of the same area. Imagine that the areas were the same, but you have all these different configurations. So this brings us to, what do we gain and we lose by having these different landscapes? There's a whole set of, there's a big debate on what should be the structure of farming. A lot of people say, look, everybody will migrate to the cities and we just need to produce in large farms. Okay, if we produce in large farms and we get these seas of maize, will we actually meet nutritional security? what would happen to agroecosystems' health? Imagine a big pest in maize occurring, so risk management becomes an issue. Yes, it will be probably more efficient from the resource use and emissions perspective, but what happens to biodiversity, to pollinating services, to zoonosis, to the social aspects, income and employment, the people that are there, will they be better off? This is something that we really need to study further, because it's currently poorly included in the studies of the future of food, or not explicitly in any of the scenarios of how are we going to produce into the future. We know that small and medium farms still produce a lot of the food in the world. This is a study that we did, really mapping farm sizes around the world, and look at the patterns for the different kinds of commodities. Obviously, you take a place like Australia and New Zealand, mostly large farms, North America as well. But in many places, you're still dealing with the true smallholders. This is the reality. And on top of that, we know that more diverse landscapes are producing more food and more nutrients, which is very, very important. This is just looking at an H index overlaid with some of these regions, and you notice that these regions, the more purple, the more food and the more diverse the production will be. So this is something to take into account for the future. We want to achieve rebalance the production of different food, but at the same time taking care of the structure of the landscapes, simply because they go together. Let me just pass this one. And it's really a total reassessment of our values. And I really think that it is essential that we start a societal conversation on this. It's not good enough to leave it in the big reports, but we need to do a lot of outreach to communities and everything. We need to really establish, well, what do we want from the food system here? Is this just a way of producing food, or is this a multifunctional system that provides a range of benefits for humanity and for ecosystems? And this will require then to delve into areas around theories of change, about really understanding what are transition pathways, impact pathways of our actions, and start really building with stakeholders notions of the future that we want. And that this will be essential. And I really hope that the Climate School really engages in facilitating these discussions at different scales. This needs to happen, from a global conversation, but then having national and really local conversations where the action is really going to happen, and where solutions will need to be deployed. Just to finalize the talk, a critical question here is on our ability to deploy innovation at speed without trade-offs. There's a lot of things happening. We did a review of what are key innovations that might come in the next 10 years. And here you see, well, we use the technology readiness assessment that NASA developed, which takes us through a nine-step ranking of all the way from research initiated to experimental proof, all the way to technologies ready to be implemented. So we are starting to see the ones like livestock and seafood substitutes, insects for food, aquaculture feeds, vertical agriculture, and so on, emerging now. But there is a beautiful pipeline here that you see that could be eventually deployed. How quick are we going to be in materializing this will be really important. Remember that the EAT-Lancet report worked on existing solutions. So we've always said, well, there's leeway still. There's leeway if some of these could be deployed. How do we create the revolutions that happen in sub-Saharan Africa, say with the mobile phone? That's the kind of thing that we want. In many cases, it will not be about just incrementally changing the enabling environment, but almost bypassing the enabling environment to some of the next steps. It's really important to think how we're going to do this kind of thing. Because the other thing that we found is that, look, even with the best of intentions, when we start really mapping this against some of the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, not all the impacts are positive. You end up having trade-offs in different parts of the system. So here you have the kinds of domains where new technology is actually being produced in the food system. These are the food system related SDG goals. And what you see here is mostly positive or neutral impacts, But when you start considering the interactions of the food SDGs with the non-food SDGs, it's where you start seeing that you start getting a few negative effects. Noticeably in aspects related to, to economic growth, equity, partnerships, peace, justice, equity. These are the big issues to actually materialize an agenda for that leaves no one behind. We've demonstrated that even with the best intentions, look, you get into the equity problems, you get into the into having a lot of losers in many parts of the world, and depending on the type of action that you take, well, the impacts will be bigger than others. Again, this will require a significant discussion. This equity issue is essential, and it was highlighted in the Global Nutrition Report, and it is something that we need to tackle directly. It's very easy to start thinking about solving climate change issues, and yes, you might get adoption of certain technologies by larger farmers and so on, and you get all excited and say, wow, people are really using what I'm producing here. But in reality, if the vulnerable don't, if we cannot create impacts for the vulnerable, the job is not done. So this is essential. This again requires a lot of work on really a proper integration of the social and economic sciences in all of this. It's not really a technological problem, but it's really an issue around building trust, around social license, transforming mindsets, creating incentives, ensuring that we safeguard against undesirable effects and so on. So it's that this linkage with the social sciences will need to feature enormously in whatever gets done in the climate school or in any program interested in solving these kinds of issues. Then last but not least, I lived in sub-Saharan Africa for over a decade, and I saw so many, so many vulnerable people suffering the effects of droughts, and I see some action occurring on the incorporation of climate risks and extreme events, but it's still not enough. This is an area that requires monumental investment to bring all this area, to bring all the climate, all the great work that climate scientists do and people working on early warning systems. There needs to be we need to work closer with them in the adaptation agenda, in how can this be mainstreamed into national programs wanting to deal with with agricultural support and safety nets and so on. I think that there's still an enormous amount of work to be done here to improve our food systems. And ultimately, yes, look, it will be expensive. I talk to a lot of economists. They say, oh, well, but that policy won't be, that policy is very inefficient because it's very costly. Well, yes, so the conversation in many cases stops there. Well, then show me a policy that is not expensive at the beginning. What we certainly know is that the cost of inactions will be even higher. So even if it appears expensive at the beginning, we need to create the big investments for making this happen. And I really hope that the climate school starts using the might of transdisciplinary research and the great ability of engaging with economists, with law practitioners, with climate scientists, with public health to really solve these very tricky problems. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure if I would have paid $3,000 for 10 megabytes of a hard drive in 1984 when they came out. But yes, let's hope for the best and for us to be able to achieve solutions at speed to make sure that the food system becomes sustainable. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Mario. So I am going to read the questions to you and we'll just work through them that way. So the first question is, would plant-based pharmaceuticals make a significant difference on environmental impact? And they say, i.e. current vaccine companies like iBio modify proteins in tobacco plants to create rapid vaccines without running the risk of mammalian contamination.
That's definitely part of the arsenal. We covered some of that material in our future technology paper, and there are important. There could be an important solution for different parts of the world. It's things like those that we really need to continue deploying. I think that the time where we could actually do a very strict priority setting on what would work well and everything, I think that that's long gone. I think that we don't have time to be as picky as before. So any deployment of a new technology with potential, we will really need to assess in its own context and really test it. But yes, I agree that those kinds of solutions will play an important part.
Great. Next question says, hi, Mario. Thanks for all this information. What would you say is the first step in convincing people that less meat is more sustainable? How do we initiate those conversations at a local level and also on a bigger scale to create policies that incentivize sustainable food systems? Yes,
that's a very good question. Thank you very much. Well, the conversation of the reduction in meat consumption is already occurring, and for many of us working on the mitigation agenda, we thought, oh my God, from people, if you tell them to stop eating meat because of the environment, they will never do it. That's the reality, and in reality, that's what happens. The economic potentials are very, very low. But when you start linking it to health, then you make it a personal problem, because it's really about people getting a disease or not. So we see this linkage to public health as an essential component of wrapping up the message of why we need to reduce meat consumption. And it's occurring already across the OECD. In terms of policies or specific policies that we need to act, it's tricky, but it really needs to go. Well, you could do a price differentiation. Many people have tried it. It doesn't work as possible as we think. In many cases, we could actually start thinking of much better labeling. That has been named as one of the options. better provenance, traceability, issues around blockchain will play also an important part. Education is named always as one of the critical things. We need to start with the kids, and this then devolves to starting with public procurement in public places, canteens, cafeterias, school lunches. This also revolves around improving our food environments. We still have food deserts in many parts of the world, where access to fruits and vegetables and other important, nutrient-rich foods are not there. So we need to actually also invest in these. And, we mentioned it in the EAT-Lancet Commission, but it was prominent in the Lancet Commission on obesity. This is even related to urban planning, the planning of cities and so on. How do you actually take nutrition and exercise as an essential component of building new spaces? And this is something that we can do when in large infrastructure projects and so on.
Great. There's a few other questions on this topic, so I'm going to skip to those. One of those questions is the stagnation or decline in red meat consumption in some countries like Europe. Was this driven by an awareness of health implications or an awareness of climate impacts, or perhaps just driven by rising prices?
It's both. In reality, real prices of meats have been going down. So the price effect is not as strong as really the realization of a climate problem, but more importantly in Europe has also been the association of intensive systems with animal welfare issues. That has actually played a significant part in reducing the consumption of animal products. When you see, there are some very extreme production systems that should be better regulated.
Great. And another question is, what are your thoughts on plant-based meats versus in-lab grown synthetic meats?
I've tried everything. So from a personal perspective, I do see these as viable options. I don't think that they will replace a full steak, but certainly for processing, for doing your spaghetti bolognese and things like that, they will be great alternatives. They are certainly growing at very fast rates. The market penetration of plant-based, I wouldn't call it meats, but plant-based materials to be used as substitutes is increasing at a rate of, it's still a tiny proportion, but it's increasing very fast. The rate is around 18.5% per year. In relation to lab grown, I think that will still be very costly in relation to potentially repurposing a lot of the plant-based food. But if there, if there are cheap sources, if the price really comes down, having that as part of the arsenal of options is a good idea.
Great. And we have a question from Cynthia. So thank you, Mario. How can EGMIP and other research groups help in accelerating food system transformations and climate resilience and mitigation all at the same time? Okay,
that's a very good question. Thanks, Cynthia. Initiatives like EGMIP I think are essential for achieving the kinds of transformations that we want. One of the key things that prevents action in all this food system area is uncertainty. And I think that one of the key things that multimodal comparisons or ensembles do is to actually help us understand uncertainty much better And that's what policymakers are actually looking for. I think that before ACMIP, we couldn't say anything about, say, the IPCC uncertainty levels in the assessments of the future of food. But we had to go and collect paper after paper, all with different starting assumptions and everything. So ACMIP came and really organized the community around around particular topics. And the fact that everybody's trying to use the same scenarios really help us a lot in really understanding where that uncertainty comes from. It's a much more integrated way of looking at the future of food. And I think that we will need a lot more ACMIP style kinds of studies in the future. I think that the models are still rudimentary for the whole agenda that we want, and not everything is included. I was having a really nice conversation with members of E3B yesterday, and a lot of the aspects related to biodiversity, to really valuing appropriately the cost of food and so on, vis-a-vis ecosystem services provision, is still something that we need to deploy in these larger assessments in an integrated way. When you have IPCC on one hand, you have IPBES on another hand. Now we're thinking in the World Food Summit of potentially doing an IPCC style food systems food systems report from now on. And if we don't integrate these three big reports and the brains of so many scientists, there will be missed opportunities and partial answers to the questions that we need solutions for. So yes, we need more ACMIPs.
Great. Next question is, how does the private sector factor into the sustainable food systems? What is the biggest lever with industry? Easy question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, I've been working with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. That includes, the Kellogg's, the Cargills, the Unilevers, and so we are deep into these discussions with the private industry, because they are the source of they're very powerful, and they're the source of large power asymmetries and lobbying in the food system. Take it from, any time that you want to deal with sugar, all they do is to lobby with billions of dollars to really ensure that some of the things don't happen. So in the conversations with this World Business Council, they say that what they need is policy incentives rather than regulations. What they would like to see is, for example, things related to tax breaks, so that they actually start changing their portfolios of food and ceasing the manufacturing of some very profitable but not very nutritious food that they produce. Of course, my answer to that is that no, you're not going to get away without the regulation, because incentives are only voluntary if you take them or not. So if you don't want to, then that leaves you off the hook. So in reality, we need to start a very, very decent conversation of well, what would be suitable regulations. Don't get me wrong, they all are trying to do as much as possible on sustainability issues, simply because of social license issues. I think that we're getting to a point where consumers are becoming pickier in what they eat, and they're more interested in provenance, etc. And this is not only in OECD countries. We see this a lot in the BRICS and in countries that have large middle classes, and eventually, low-income countries will end up needing the same kinds of things. So yeah, the conversation is ongoing. It's a tricky one, but there is a lot of will also from their part.
Great. So we are at time, so it's 6 p.m. So I'm sorry to everyone who asked questions that we couldn't get to, but we will share your questions with Mario, and also, please feel free to follow up with him individually via email. So thank you so much, Mario, for being with us today at this inaugural Climate School lecture. It was a fascinating talk, and we're grateful to have had you with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to participate in this event. Thanks for listening.